The story you will hear today has never been told in its entirety. Enoch, son of Cain, a man whose name is marked by pain and guilt, lived in a world of darkness where redemption seemed unattainable. But did you know that even in the midst of despair, there is a search for meaning and something deeper? What can a man build when guilt is his only companion? What does he really find when he tries to escape his own shadow? Enoch, the son of Cain, grew up in a city that should not exist, built on the weight of pain and the search for an eternity without God. And it is in this dark scenario that an essential question arises. What happens to a soul that lives in a building without forgiveness, without divine light? In this video, we will delve into the forgotten story of Enoch, the man who inherited a city without faith, but also with a destiny far greater than he ever imagined. Follow us to the end and discover how this story can transform your own view of redemption and healing, and how you can find answers in the midst of life's spiritual desert. Don't leave this video until you find out what happened to Enoch's soul. Thousands of years ago, in the heart of a world marked by mysteries and conflicts, a city emerged that should never have existed. A city built with stones and blood, without the presence of God, but loaded with a weight that no one seemed to understand. Its founder, Cain, known for being humanity's first murderer, had been banished from Eden, and with him, all hope of redemption seemed lost. But what drives a man, scarred by such a heinous crime, to try to create something lasting in the heart of pain? What could justify the construction of a city that did not bear the name of God, but that of his son, Enoch? Throughout history, we learn that the most extreme actions are often driven by a deep desire for redemption or escape. What Cain did when he built a city was not just building walls of stone and palaces of clay. He was, in fact, trying to build a fortress against the very weight of guilt, the memory of his act, and against the emptiness that the absence of God leaves in the human heart. The city of Enoch, which emerged from the despair of a man who believed he could no longer be forgiven, would become the stage for a story forgotten by most. Have you ever wondered what happens to the soul of a person who builds something without ever asking for forgiveness? What happens when a civilization rises in the name of escaping pain, rather than in search of true redemption? The answer lies in the path Cain chose in naming the city after his son. A new beginning, yes, but a faithless beginning. In creating Enoch, Cain desired something that would overcome the traumas of the past, a future that would be strong and immune to the shadows of what he had done. But, instead of a place of healing, the city would become a symbol of the human attempt to overcome the wounds of the soul without resorting to what could really heal them. Enoch, the son of Cain, would grow up in the midst of this construction, observing what humanity was capable of when it moved away from the divine light. What would he do with this city? How would he deal with the weight of being the heir to a name that carried a curse, and at the same time, the burden of being part of a generation that tried to find meaning without looking to the Creator? These questions are more than old. They are the essence of our own search for identity, purpose, and faith. This is the beginning of the story of Enoch, the untold story that unfolded in the sands of time but echoes to this day. It is a journey of questioning, searching, and above all, understanding that man cannot build anything lasting without first facing the emptiness within himself. The city of Enoch is not just a physical place, but a reflection of the heart of a man who, in the face of pain, tried to create an eternity that refused to be fulfilled. Now, imagine Enoch's youth, the attentive gaze, bare feet on the dry earth, watching each stone being placed, each wall being erected. He didn't just see the walls of a growing city, he saw the walls inside himself, an invisible construction made of anguish, silence, and the incessant search for answers. And it was in this scenario that his soul began to question, where is God in all this? The city grew. But as the towers rose, so did the silence in his heart. The city, in its material grandeur, increasingly became a spiritual desert. The question that arose for Enoch was not about what he should do with the city, but about what he should do with himself in the midst of this empty construction. These questions would accompany him throughout his life, and it would be the search for an answer to these questions that would take him to a destiny far beyond the limits of the city that his father built. The city of Enoch was not just an architectural landmark. It was, in essence, a human attempt to overcome the curse that Cain carried with him. The fact that Cain decided to build a city in a place so far from Eden, far from the memories of the lost paradise, is significant. The construction was not just a practical need for housing, but a profound attempt to create something lasting, something that was immune to what he feared, oblivion and condemnation. The city's name, Enoch, was not a tribute to God, but to his own son, a symbol of a new beginning. However, this new beginning was not based on faith. The city that Cain built was a reflection of his own rejection of the divine presence, a society that rose without any spiritual bond. When looking at the growth of this city, it is difficult not to see the parallels with civilizations that, throughout history, have sought to establish themselves on principles that ignore or even reject God. According to the study of historians, the first great cities in the world, such as Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, were born in periods where the worship of pagan gods overlapped with the worship of the one God. These cities were, in many ways, built in the name of human sovereignty, where man saw himself as the center of creation, leaving aside any notion of spiritual dependence. Cain, therefore, was not creating something unique or unprecedented. He simply followed a human model that, throughout the ages, would be repeated. Even though the city of Enoch began simply, with stones and wood, it soon expanded, not only physically, but also socially. Cain was not alone in his construction. He was accompanied by other men, fugitives and exiles, like himself. These men, seeking redemption or oblivion, were drawn by the promise of a new beginning, but that beginning was doomed to be empty. The society that Cain was building was not based on principles of love, faith, or divine justice, but on a human understanding of success. What began to take shape was not just a city, but a culture based on the idea that human effort could be enough to fill the deepest voids in the soul. The construction of the city was an allegory of a civilization that rises without the presence of God. Every stone that Cain placed, every wall that he erected, was a reflection of human pride. According to the work, The Rise of Civilizations, the true strength of human societies has always been in their ability to understand their relationship with something greater than themselves. When civilizations begin to build on a foundation of pride or selfishness, rather than humility and dependence on the divine, they tend to crumble. The history of humanity is full of examples of empires and nations that, at the height of their material power, fell due to moral and spiritual decay. It is interesting to note that the word civilization has roots in the Latin civitas, which means city, but also implies community and belonging. True civilization, according to many thinkers throughout history, is only complete when it incorporates morality, ethics, and spirituality at its core. Enoch's civilization, on the contrary, was being built on the forgetting of these fundamental values. Each victory was celebrated as human progress, but the city inside was becoming increasingly empty. The absence of God in the construction of Enoch was what made it, paradoxically, a civilization that failed before it was even born. Cain's mistake was not just killing his brother, but trying to raise a new generation that did not depend on God, ignoring the lessons of human history. When Cain looked to the horizon and began planning the city of Enoch, he was, in effect, ignoring the scars of humanity. He tried to erase what had already been done, as if that were possible. But like anyone looking to build their life on sand, he was creating something that wouldn't last. Years passed, and the city grew. The houses began to take shape, the squares were established, and the first towers began to tear up the sky, a symbol of human pride. But there was something strange about all this. As much as people celebrated the city's growth, something was missing. The parties, The banquets, the dances, and the music, all of it seemed like a big, empty spectacle. There were no altars, there were no sacrifices, and there were no prayers. The city that Cain built, although prosperous in material terms, was spiritually dead. It was a city that lived in constant denial of the need for God, a city where men gathered to build but never to reflect, where the pillars of their homes were made of stone, the pillars of their souls were falling. In Enoch's story, the silent questioning of a child who watched everything without fully understanding became the only echo of a soul that was not in the midst of all that progress. Enoch, growing up in the midst of this civilization, began to realize that the physical growth of the city did not mean spiritual growth. It was as if the very stones that supported the city of Enoch were carrying an invisible weight, a weight that could not be borne by its founders. In a way, the story of Cain and Enoch reflects the human paradox of building empires that, instead of elevating us, bind us. Empires that disregard the need for a spiritual foundation are not empires of freedom, but of slavery, not to the God who creates and sustains, but to the human will itself. They rise, like the towers of Babel, full of pride and vanity, but they are destined to fall because deep down their foundation is fragile. Thus the city of Enoch, although it began with dreams of freedom and glory, soon became a symbol of despair. The freedom it promised was not true freedom, but an invisible prison, a prison of pride and vanity. The problem of the city of Enoch was not in the construction of its walls, but in the construction of the souls that lived there. What was built with so much effort and sweat in the streets, in the squares, and in the houses was just a facade which hid the spiritual emptiness that grew silently within each man and woman who called that place home. The story of the city of Enoch, in the end, is the story of a civilization without God. A civilization that, no matter how hard it tries to create something immortal, will never find peace or meaning as long as it moves away from what truly values life. No matter how much the walls grow, no matter how much the towers rise, the void inside each person will always be greater than any human construction. True purpose, true civilization, can only be achieved when man looks beyond himself, beyond his own abilities, and turns to the one who created everything that exists. Enoch grew up looking at the city his father had built, but something was profoundly missing. Despite the grandeur of the place, the rapid growth of buildings, and the apparent prosperity that spread throughout the streets, he felt an emptiness within himself that could not be filled by the material successes he saw around him. From an early age, Enoch was a silent spectator of the great city built with so much effort. He saw the movement of people, the celebrations in the squares, and the celebrations on nights lit by fireworks, but all of that seemed distant to him, as if there were an invisible barrier that separated him from everyone. He was part of that world, but at the same time, he was completely alien to its essence. The emptiness that Enoch felt was not just the emptiness of a childhood without love or affection, but something deeper, something existential. He couldn't understand why he felt incomplete. How could he explain a void that extended beyond any concrete lack? He lived in a city that seemed to have it all: security, wealth, progress, and yet there was an absence. There was a lack of meaning. Enoch didn't know where this feeling came from, but he felt it in every corner of the city, in every stone placed, in the sound of tools hitting the walls and the earth. It was as if the place was empty inside, despite its successful appearance. This feeling of loneliness was not caused by a lack of company or the absence of people. Enoch lived with many people, but he felt that there was no one who really understood him, no one who really shared his feeling of something incomplete. He saw others, his parents, his neighbors, the workers who built the city, and they all seemed so focused on what they were doing, so absorbed in their own constructions and routines, that none of them seemed to question what he was asking. What are we really building here? He observed the growing city with a curious but, at the same time, distant gaze. Each wall erected, each tower that appeared on the horizon, seemed to further increase the empty space he carried within him. The city, in its brilliance, made no sense to him, and he didn't know how to express this discomfort, this incompleteness. The society around them was so busy building something physical, something visible, that no one seemed to notice the absence of that which was invisible but essential, meaning spirituality, the connection with something greater. It is important to understand that Enoch's loneliness did not refer to a simple lack of social interaction. The loneliness he experienced was more philosophical and spiritual. It was the absence of a deeper understanding of life and the purpose he unconsciously sought. He was surrounded by people, but he felt like he didn't have a real connection with them. There was no sense of belonging, of being with someone who shared the same yearning, the same search for meaning. In a city that stood tall with so much pride, what was missing was the recognition that the purpose of its existence could not be found in hard work or material growth alone. The concept of existential loneliness is something that many philosophers, such as Søren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre, have explored. For them, loneliness is not simply being physically isolated, but it is the feeling of being disconnected from the true essence of life, of not finding satisfactory answers to the great questions of existence. The search for meaning, for purpose, becomes a lonely journey because no one can provide it from the outside. It is something that is found within each person, and in Enoch's case, the emptiness he felt was evidence that he was not finding this meaning within his city, nor in the people around him. He began to realize that everything around him, the buildings, the parties, the festivities, were just distractions that hid the emptiness that every human being carries when they don't connect with the greater purpose of their life. As Enoch grew up, his perception of the city became more complex. He began to understand that, despite everything the city represented that was grand and imposing, it was, in fact, a reflection of a society that was moving away from spirituality. He saw others dedicating themselves tirelessly to work, to creating new structures and symbols of power, but he questioned whether it had any real value. The city, for him, was being built on a foundation of pride, vanity, and self-sufficiency, and the absence of God in that construction was something he could not ignore. The inner emptiness that Enoch felt was also related to his understanding of his father's legacy. Cain, Abel's killer, was responsible for the founding of that city. Enoch knew his father's story, the terrible crime he had committed, and this also weighed on him. He could not understand how the city could be seen as a glory when it bore the mark of sin, the mark of his father's curse. For Enoch, the city did not represent salvation, but the desperate attempt to escape a past that could never be erased. Enoch's loneliness, therefore, was not just a reaction to the social life that surrounded him. It was a response to the absence of meaning, a consequence of the disconnect between people and spirituality. He felt like something was missing in his life, but he didn't know how to fill that void. The parties and celebrations that filled the city made no sense to him. They seemed to be just a way of filling the hole left by the lack of faith, by the absence of something deeper that united people. The noise of the streets, the sound of tools hitting stones, and the laughter and singing of celebrations, all of this seemed drowned out by the feeling that something was out of place. There was a silent echo in Enoch's heart, an echo that resonated from an emptiness he could not explain, but knew was there. This void was not something he could fill with the things he saw around him. Enoch's city was a construction made by human hands, but Enoch felt that the true purpose of his life could not be found in something as ephemeral as a city built on the pride of one man. And that put him in an inner conflict. He saw the city grow, but at the same time he saw its soul wither. It was as if, as the city expanded, he moved further and further away from his true essence, his true quest. Enoch grew up with this feeling of loneliness and emptiness, and over the years he began to understand that that emptiness could not be filled with more construction, more parties, or more material achievements. He knew there was something more, something he couldn't fully understand, but that called to him, silently, from within his soul. This emptiness, this silence, this absence became Enoch's greatest companion as he grew up in the city built by his father. Something inside him knew that true construction, the one he sought, could not be made with stones, bricks, and wood. It would have to be done with something more: faith, purpose, and above all, with a deeper connection with the Creator. This is Enoch's existential dilemma. He was living in a city full of noise, but his spirit was silent, searching for answers that could not be found in the physical world around him. Enoch's emptiness was not just a lack of companionship, but a lack of something deeper and more essential, a connection to something that transcended humanity and gave him a real purpose in life. He didn't know where to look for it, but he felt that this emptiness was the biggest weight in his life. As the years passed and Enoch matured, the emptiness within him only deepened. The city around him, although full of movement and life, could not fill the gap he felt in his soul. And no matter how grand Cain's city became, Enoch's existential anguish seemed to intensify with each new day. He could no longer ignore the feeling that there was something beyond what the eye could see, something that was behind everything, something that his mind couldn't fully comprehend, but that he felt deeply. The search for something greater, for a truth that escaped his understanding, became the force that drove his steps. As a young man, Enoch did not know exactly what he was looking for, but the feeling that life had a greater meaning than the physical constructions that surrounded him became increasingly evident. The city of Enoch, in its appearance of prosperity, was only a reflection of what men could build with their own hands, but Enoch felt that there was a fundamental flaw there. He could not convince himself that all the material wealth, all the celebrations, and all the adornments of the city were enough to fill his inner need for truth and meaning. The questioning that began to grow within Enoch was inevitable. He wondered why the people around him were so involved in their everyday lives, in their buildings and parties, as if that were what really mattered. Doesn't anyone else realize that this is all empty? Isn't there anyone else questioning why we're here? He thought to himself in silence. Enoch did not see anyone around him willing to reflect on these mysteries. The city was made up of people who sought to prosper, but who seemed to be completely absent of any reflection on their true purpose or what was hidden behind those superficial existences. The fact that Cain, his father, was the founder of the city, and at the same time the man marked by the guilt of Abel's murder, weighed deeply on Enoch. He knew that his lineage was embroiled in a bloody tragedy, and he could not ignore the relationship between his father's sin and the state of that city that stood, seemingly solid, but filled with a spiritual shadow. Cain, who had been expelled from Eden, was trying to build something that, in his mind, could bring a sense of control and redemption. But the truth was that the city of Enoch could never redeem itself without facing the root of the evil that had been present since its beginning. Enoch could not escape this reality. The city, for him, represented an attempt to ignore humanity itself, an effort to erase the scars of the past and create a new identity that could be sustained only by human effort. But he knew, somewhere deep within, that the true answer lay not in the stone walls that rose around him, but in something greater, something beyond the reach of his hands. He didn't know where to look for it, but he felt like he should. Something called him beyond the city limits, beyond his own limits. Over time, Enoch began to spend more time alone, walking in the mountains around the city. There, where the sound of construction didn't reach and the noise of the city faded, he could hear his own mind more clearly. The isolation of the mountains allowed him to contemplate the big questions that worried him, far from the distractions that city life imposed. And it was in this isolation that he began to feel a presence. Not a physical presence, but something that was beyond the mountains and the city, something he couldn't see but could feel in his soul. During these solitary walks, Enoch began to question himself deeply about his own existence. Why am I here? What do I do with this life? Why does everything around me seem so empty? These questions became the constant thoughts that accompanied him as he watched the stars at night, the endless sky above his head. He knew there was more to the universe than simply living and building. Life was much bigger than what was seen around him. What he was looking for was something that could not be found in tangible things, in human constructions, but something beyond all that. He didn't know what it was exactly, but he felt he was beginning to understand that the true meaning of life was related to a higher force, something that transcended any human creation. Enoch's emptiness was not one of absence of knowledge, but of perception. He was beginning to realize that what the city offered him was insignificant compared to what he sought. Stone buildings and buildings, however grand, were only temporary products of human skill. They were not eternal. They weren't what he was looking for. And as he looked at the horizon, at the mountains and the sky, he felt there was something there, something in the cosmos, something calling him to a greater journey. Enoch's search for something beyond himself, for a universal truth, was a search for transcendence. The idea of transcendence is not something new. Throughout history, humanity has sought to understand what lies beyond physical reality. Plato, in his dialogues, spoke about the world of ideas, the reality that transcends the material world. For him, the physical world was just a shadow of the true reality. Enoch, without being aware of these philosophical ideas, was experiencing in his own soul the search for this deeper truth. This quest for something greater was not just an intellectual matter for Enoch, but a matter of spiritual life and death. He was beginning to realize that the city of Enoch, built with so much pride and sweat, was no longer enough for him. It was like a body without a soul, an empty building that could collapse at any moment. He felt like his soul was being suffocated by the lack of meaning, by the absence of a greater purpose. And as his search for answers took him away from the distractions and noise of the city, he was beginning to understand that, to find what he sought, he would have to abandon the path of human pride and seek something that connected him to something greater than himself. But what would that something bigger be? Enoch did not have a definitive answer to these questions, but his search for answers guided him. He felt that this superior force, which he was beginning to intuit, was not found in human constructions, in monuments of pride and vanity, but in something that was invisible but much more real than anything made by man. He knew that the true answer to his emptiness was not in more work or more building, but in that which transcends the physical, the spiritual, the divine. This realization began to change the way Enoch saw himself and the world around him. He knew there was something more, something he couldn't fully explain, but that guided him with every step he took. He was still lost. He still didn't know the exact path, but the search for something greater had already become the center of his life. He felt, more than ever, that he was searching for the truth that was hidden behind the curtain of a reality that he now saw as fragile and empty. This quest of Enoch, which began with internal questioning about his life and the purpose of the city in which he lived, was now becoming a spiritual journey. The city of Enoch, built on human vanity and self-sufficiency, was becoming the stage for a much greater internal battle, which was about the human being's search for something transcendental, for something that connected him with the divine. The growing tension within Enoch could not be clearer. As much as he tried to deceive himself, telling himself that there was something great about the city his father had created, the truth was that he was increasingly distant from that belief. The search for something greater was not just a philosophical or existential question, but a deep cry from his soul, something he could no longer ignore. His connection to the city and Cain's legacy was disintegrating as he advanced in his search for truth and spirituality. As Enoch grew, the city of Cain expanded imposingly, but something was wrong. The physical growth of the city was not reflected in moral or spiritual growth. Enoch felt this intensely. His experience in the city, in which human pride mixed with a feeling of profound emptiness, made him see clearly the disconnect between what the city represented and what he wanted for his own life. He no longer felt part of that construction. The weight of his father's name, which everyone in the city revered with fear, was not enough to sustain the sense of belonging he expected. Cain, his father, lived in a state of constant internal struggle. He had built the city as a symbol of power and recovery, but he knew deep in his soul that there was no human construction that could erase the weight of his sin. However, Cain never accepted what was happening inside him. He clung to the idea that the city he created would be the legacy he would leave to the world, the symbol of his redemption, a work that would purge his guilt and bring him peace. But as time passed, Cain saw how far his own efforts were from the true redemption he sought. He didn't know how to deal with the growing frustration and silence from the Creator that seemed to plague him every day. It was in this scenario of internal tension and growing distance that the confrontation between father and son, which seemed inevitable, began to take shape. Enoch, increasingly isolated, watched his father's actions with a growing sense of disillusionment. Cain, in turn, saw Enoch not as the son he had longed for, but as a silent threat to what he believed to be his great work. Enoch was not just a spectator of the city. He was questioning, asking questions of himself and everyone around him, seeking something that the city and his father could not offer him. Cain knew this, and he felt his son's restlessness as a reflection of his own emptiness that he also carried but couldn't admit. Cain tried, in every possible way, to show Enoch the value of his construction. He taught him about the importance of the city, about how that place was unique and should be remembered as the great achievement of a man who had been expelled from paradise, but who was still capable of creating something great. He believed this was the only way to make Enoch understand the magnitude of his work, as a way to justify his own redemption. But Enoch did not share this view. The growing distance between father and son began to manifest itself not only in Enoch's silence, but also in the words he began to utter. Enoch questioned the value of the city, the reason for building something that did not have the presence of the Creator at its core. "Why do we do all this?" he asked once, looking at his father with the eyes of someone who no longer believed in what was being done. "Why do we continue to build walls and towers if there is no more life in our hearts?" These words hit Cain with the force of a blow. He wasn't prepared to hear that from his own son. Cain, who had always seen the city as a symbol of his strength and skill, found himself, for the first time, confronted with the true nature of his creation. Enoch's silence, his refusal to participate in a celebration he could not understand, began to reveal to Cain the painful truth. He had built something that could not provide what his soul truly sought. The confrontation between father and son intensified as Enoch began to further explore his own questioning. He moved further away from the festivities and the busy life of the city, seeking answers in his moments of solitude. The young man began to feel that there was an answer beyond human constructions, beyond the city of Cain. He began to realize that the true transformation would not occur in the construction of something material, but in something deeper, something that could not be touched, but that was essential to his soul. Enoch desired something more than power and wealth. He wanted to understand the real purpose of life, the reason for his existence, and how he could restore his connection with God. Meanwhile, Cain remained in his blindness, clinging to what he believed to be the only legacy he had left. He could not admit that his city, built with so much effort, was actually a representation of his failure. Cain could not accept that the presence of God, which he had lost, was the only thing capable of giving true strength to his creation. He felt increasingly lonely in his own city, as if he were trying to fill an abyss that could never be filled with stone and wood. The moment of the final confrontation was approaching. Enoch, already far from the festivities and distractions of the city, asked his father a direct question. "Don't you see, father?" said Enoch, his eyes fixed on Cain. "What we are building has no foundation. There is nothing here that unites us with God. We are just creating a prison for our souls." Enoch's words were like a punch in the gut to Cain, who had always seen his city as the only solution to his own problems. He didn't know how to react, as these words echoed a truth he didn't want to hear. Enoch looked at the city, at the high towers and the great walls that Cain had built, but everything seemed empty to him. He felt there was something deeper that his soul needed, something that was far beyond his father's material achievements. He knew that the true construction was not physical, but spiritual. "I can't stay here any longer, Father," said Enoch, finally expressing his decision. "I need to find something that goes beyond all of this, something that connects us to what really matters." Cain's reaction was one of pain he had never experienced. He knew he was losing his son, but he couldn't understand why. The city, which he believed to be his greatest achievement, was now becoming the reason he was losing everything that truly mattered. The city that Cain had built as an attempt to escape his guilt now became the symbol of his failure. He had built an empire of vanity without realizing that what he really needed, reconciliation with God and with his own soul, could not be found in human pride, but in humility before the Creator. The confrontation between father and son was not just an exchange of words, but a spiritual battle, a profound dilemma about what really matters in life. Enoch, in his search for something greater, had finally confronted the truth of his own existence, while Cain, trapped in his creation and his pride, could not see the truth that was before him. Enoch knew that his path was beyond the city, beyond his father's legacy, and that the true construction of life was in his search for faith, for something that transcended human and physical limitations. The fate of both was marked by this internal struggle. Enoch, unlike his father, moved away from the city, knowing that true freedom and redemption could not be found in stone monuments, but in connection with something divine, something eternal. The confrontation between Cain and Enoch was not just about words, but about the difference between building a human empire and seeking the spiritual truth that could only be found in the silence of a heart open to God. Silence took over Enoch after his final words to Cain. He knew more than ever that the decision he was making at that moment was not just about moving away from the city, but about changing the course of his life irrevocably. There was something in his soul that could no longer be ignored. The city of Enoch, with all its material grandeur and imposing structures, no longer offered him anything. The streets and squares, which before seemed the center of everything, now seemed empty to him, as if each stone and each brick carried the weight of a farce that he no longer wanted to be part of. Enoch's decision was not made in anger or resentment. On the contrary, he felt a deep sadness at distancing himself from the place where he had grown up, from the father who, although in his error, was still a figure he loved. But the truth, which he was beginning to perceive clearly, pushed him towards something greater, something beyond the city limits, beyond the constructions made by human hands. He knew that his soul was searching for something that could not be found in the material world, and this spiritual journey was the only path he had left. Cain, in turn, could not understand his son's decision. For him, the city he had built was all he had. Enoch was his legacy, and the thought of seeing him go, rejecting what he considered to be his greatest achievement, seemed like an irremediable loss. Cain no longer knew what to do to convince his son that the city was the only way, the only chance for redemption. He found himself lost in his own pride, in his own attempt to reverse what he had done, and he failed to see that the true path to inner peace lay through a deeper change, a change that Enoch was beginning to understand. As Enoch left, walking away from the city, he felt the weight of the unknown on his shoulders, but at the same time, a sense of relief took over his spirit. He knew that what he was doing was not an escape, but a search. The search for something bigger than the city, bigger than his father's building, something he couldn't explain, but that he felt with all the intensity of his being. The search for God. But what exactly was he looking for? He didn't know yet. All he knew was that he was heading towards what he felt was the path of truth, even though he had no maps or guides. Enoch's spiritual journey was not just a physical journey, but an inner journey. He was beginning to realize that the true search for peace was not in ready answers, nor in easy explanations. It was not a path found in books or in the words of others, but a journey he would have to take for himself. The search for something greater was something deeply personal, something that could not be imposed from outside. He began to understand that, to find the truth he was looking for, he would need to delve inside himself and face his own fears, his own doubts, and his own limitations. On his walk, Enoch began to reflect on everything he had experienced up to that moment. The city of Cain represented for him a human attempt to control destiny, to build something that was eternal and immortal. But Enoch knew that true immortality was not in material things, but in that which transcends time and space, the human soul, the connection with the divine. The buildings made by his father were only temporary, like all things made by men. But what he began to seek was eternal, something that no one could take away from him. In the first days of his journey, Enoch felt the weight of loneliness. He was far from everything he knew, in unfamiliar terrain. But as he walked, he began to feel a connection he couldn't explain. The wind blowing, the sound of leaves on the trees, the silence of the night. All of it seemed to whisper to him something that he couldn't understand, but that he felt deeply. It was as if nature itself was speaking to him, as if he was being guided by something greater than himself. He didn't know for sure, but he felt that by moving away from the city and his parents' pride, he was finally finding what he was looking for. Enoch's journey was not easy. He faced physical and emotional difficulties along the way. Loneliness consumed him on many occasions, and doubts about what he was doing assaulted him. But the search for a greater purpose, for something that was beyond human limitations, was what sustained him. He didn't yet know what he would find, but he knew he was heading toward what his soul needed. And, at some point along this journey, he began to understand that the answer was not somewhere far away, but within himself, in the deep desire to connect with something more. As Enoch walked, he also began to realize that true freedom was not in escaping the city or his father, but in freeing himself from the bonds that prevented him from living authentically. The city, with its pride and vanity, represented everything he now rejected. But the journey he undertook was not an escape from the city or from Cain, but a search for true spiritual freedom. He wanted to find peace that did not depend on what was outside of him, but on what was inside. Along his journey, Enoch began to feel a presence, not a physical presence, but an indescribable feeling that he was being guided by something beyond his own understanding. He felt that he was no longer alone, that his search for something greater was being accompanied by a higher force. This sense of spiritual guidance became stronger as he walked, and Enoch began to understand that the true journey was not just about finding something outside oneself, but about connecting with the essence of life, with the force that creates and sustains the entire universe. With each step he took, Enoch felt more clearly that his journey was not only linked to the search for answers, but also to the transformation of his own soul. He was beginning to realize that his true spiritual journey was not about reaching a physical or material destination, but about achieving an inner peace, a harmony with the divine. And this peace could not be found in anything that was made by men, but in that which transcends everything, in that which can only be experienced spiritually. Deep within him, Enoch knew he was being prepared for something greater. What that meant exactly, he still didn't know. But he was willing to follow, to continue his journey, to seek something that his soul already knew to be true, even if his mind could not yet fully comprehend it. And so, as he walked through the vast landscapes and silent fields, Enoch felt, with each step, that his soul was finally being purified. He was leaving behind not only the city of Cain, but also the need to fill his emptiness with material things, with power, and with pride. He was moving toward what really mattered, spiritual truth, connection with God. This spiritual journey of Enoch, although still uncertain in many aspects, began to take shape within his heart. He knew he was searching for something that could not be described in words, but that, over time, would reveal itself to him in profound and transformative ways. What he sought was not a physical destination, but a spiritual experience that would change his life forever. Enoch's spiritual journey was just beginning, but he already felt in his spirit that he was on the right path. He knew that as he walked into the unknown, he was finally finding what his soul had searched for so long. The story of Cain and Enoch teaches us a profound lesson about what truly sustains our lives. Cain, when trying to build a city to erase his past, believed that human power could overcome guilt and pain. His city, although physically great, collapsed because it was built on pride and vanity without a spiritual foundation. Enoch, on the other hand, followed a different path. When he walked away from this empty building, he began a journey in search of something greater, something that could not be seen, but that was inside. The collapse of the city of Cain was inevitable because without a solid foundation of faith and truth, everything we built could collapse. What Enoch found along his journey was not something material, but a connection with the divine, something that transcends what men can create. True transformation does not come from the things we can control, but from surrendering to a greater purpose, which guides us and gives us true peace. This story invites us to reflect on our own lives. Are we, like Cain, trying to fill our voids with what we can touch and control? Or are we, like Enoch, seeking something that goes beyond the visible? True construction is not done with bricks and stones, but with faith, purpose, and spiritual connection. As we reflect on these questions, we realize that true strength comes from humility and the pursuit of truth, not pride or self-sufficiency. The lesson is clear. Without a spiritual foundation, everything we build, no matter how grand it may seem, is at risk of failure. Therefore, it is essential to question what we are really looking for. In our lives, what are we trying to build, and why? The story of Cain and Enoch reminds us that true peace and redemption come not from our own strength, but from surrender to something greater and deeper. May we, like Enoch, abandon illusions of control and move towards what really matters, connection with the divine, purpose, and inner transformation. This will give us the strength necessary to build something lasting and true, something that goes beyond the ephemeral constructions of the world. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.